Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar. We're really excited to have you to join us all today. Just whilst we wait for some people to join us, I'll introduce myself. I'm Thomas Novotny, and together with our two exciting speakers, we'll delve into the topic of supply chain sustainability, the metrics-driven path to positive change. So before we begin, I'll cover off some housekeeping. You can ask any questions you have during the talks by popping them in the Ask a Question option under the video, and our speakers will aim to answer them at the end of the session. You can find any additional resources in the attachment section and rate this webinar to let us know your comments and suggestions. All of today's slides and recordings will be emailed to you, so feel free to share them with your colleagues and anyone who might find this session useful. We have some great insights coming to you today, so without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. Today with us, we have Claire Fitton, our Smeta Evolution and Impact Lead at SEDEX. Claire is a social sustainability specialist with over 15 years experience working in both not-for-profit and private sectors to improve working conditions in global supply chains. With a master's in human rights law, specializing in business and human rights, she has worked with companies, trade unions, NGOs, and government bodies on the practical implementation and effectiveness of human rights due diligence practices. And special guest Ian Hind, who leads partnerships at unit-wide, leveraging his background in mechanical engineering and extensive experience in the tech industry. He's worked in various tech startups and at Microsoft, managing enterprise customers across manufacturing and retail. Passionate about sustainability and technology, Ian is empowering complex supply chains to decarbonize by harnessing the two together. So, when we look at our agenda today, both of our speakers will cover off the key metrics for measuring social and environmental impact to improve your supply chain sustainability, reporting frameworks to showcase your sustainability performance, using technology for data connection, analysis, and driving impact on both human rights and decarbonisation, enhancing transparency and stakeholder engagement, as well as a Q&A session at the end. So a brief intro into SEDEX. So SEDEX is a global technology company that specializes in data, insights, and professional services to empower supply chain sustainability. Our platform, tools, and services enable businesses to easily manage and improve their environmental, social, and governance performance to meet their supply chain sustainability goals. We currently have over 85,000 members with 104 active supplier sites. We're proud to say that we also have 1 in 10 Fortune 500 companies who are SEDEX members. So what we're going to try and do now, we're having some technical issues, but Claire, can we hear you today? Otherwise, we're going to hand over to Ian.
Let's test. How's that? Oh, what a relief. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Tom. And I'm glad we managed to get those last little niggles sorted just in the nick of time. It's a pleasure to talk to you all today. I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we can use data better, both to drive our human rights due diligence, but also to report on it and how the two are kind of fundamental to each other. Great. So starting off with data-led human rights due diligence. For those of you, I'm sure many of you are aware of what human rights due diligence is, but for those of you who this may be new to, due diligence is the process by which companies should be acting in order to reduce their negative impacts on both people and the environment within their supply chain. So this is the process that you undertake in order to reduce those risks and those negative impacts. It is very much a kind of cyclical process. Due diligence is about continuous improvement. You can never complete due diligence, you can never finish and wash your hands of all the work that you have done. This is something which is a constant learning model. And what you need to be able to learn and to continuously improve is you need data. So you need to be able to see the results of your action, to be able to make the next steps, to be able to understand what the best next steps are for you, to really take those long-term actions and those continuous actions. So that's why taking a data-led approach to due diligence is really critical. Not just understanding what you need to do, but the why you need to do it, backed by real live data. Move us along. This just here is the diagram of the OECD's due diligence cycle. We're just going to talk a little bit through this process over the next few slides and how what data is useful for both reporting on these areas, but also how you can use that data to take next steps and to really improve the due diligence that you do. So starting at the beginning with your governance and with those policy commitments. A lot of reporting frameworks out there, or previous reporting frameworks, really had a real heavy focus on policies within your supply chain, what policies you have, the number of policies, both internally, but also across your supply chain. And that was a really critical kind of KPI for many years. There's been a lot of criticism of this as a KPI, as an indicator of performance against due diligence, as it has no kind of evidence against the effectiveness of those policies, of those next steps that are out there. But it is really fundamental still to show your commitment as a business. So you do want to still be collecting and publishing that data on what exactly you have yourself committed to, what your policies are, but also whether those policy commitments are also duplicated across your supply chain. And when I'm talking about what they are, I'm really talking about which risks you've identified and which you have policy commitments against. Are you working on reducing working hours? Are you committed to improving wages? Are you committed to enabling freedom of association? Are you committed to reducing discrimination across your own operations and those of your supply chains? When we look at how to really understand which of those policies have a little bit more effectiveness behind them, where they are more supportive, we're really looking at how many of these are published publicly. So there's a public commitment from a business which shows that they are more committed, they are more likely to be more committed to action, and whether or not they have got executive sign-off. So do they have the commitment of a board member, of someone in a responsibility and accountable position, signing off those policies and commitments? Publishing how many policies and commitments you have is just the start of it. How do you start to use that data? If you're looking across your supply chain, you can look at where there is low level of commitment. What have you committed to working on that you're not seeing reflected across your supply chain? Do you see no senior endorsement of the policy commitments that are important to your business that you might be looking to target? Do you see that there's capacity building opportunities there to really onboard your suppliers to the same commitments that you have? And then you can use this data to compare with other data sources, start to do some of the next step analysis here. Which countries and commodities that you have in your supply chain have got weak policies and commitments, or low levels of policy commitments, where there are high levels of risk? We have an internal risk assessment tool called Radar within SEDEX that can help you with this analysis. It can really show what risks are prevalent in which geographies and which sectors. And are you seeing those policy commitments to work on those areas where they are most needed? Within our own operations, we are also really working to help to make this data more accessible. In our next update of our SMETA methodology, we're really breaking down the policy commitments as they appear in all sites by base code area. So you'll get that very granular detail to hand as to whether or not there are commitments made which are endorsed at an executive level by sites, by base code area, so by working hours, by freedom of association, by commitment to work on modern slavery, all these different areas that may be important to your business. Moving us along to this next part of our due diligence cycle, and that is the continuation of this risk assessment. So you've assessed where you've got policies and what policies you plan to work on. Now you need to know where you need to work, what activities you need to do. When you're evidencing this, what people want to see, what reporters want to see, what is needed from a reporting for legislative purposes and also for ESG reporting. They want to see what your salient issues are, what you have identified within your supply chain that is the most salient issue. So salience here is different from what you may be doing for other forms of reporting. Salience risks are the risks that are the most critical to the people or the planet. So these are where the risks are highest to people or planet, as opposed to risk to business. And that is what the due diligence cycle is asking you to report on. It is asking you to identify where the risks are highest to those who will be impacted by those risks, as opposed to business. You want to start to report on useful data that can contextualize whether you've identified the right salient risks for your supply chain. Do you know the gender split of your workforce, which can help you to understand how these risks will impact different workers in different ways, different categories of workers in different ways? Have you published your supply chain, your tier 1 supply chain, or a commodity supply chain externally? This shows again your commitment to really work on these areas, to work with those suppliers on these risk areas. So again, when we're using this data, we're looking for commonalities. We're looking for areas that we can increase our leverage in the work that we do. Where is the same risk recurring plenty of times within your supply chain? Can you do a thematic piece of work to really look at that area? Do you have the same risk in cropping up in multiple sites? So you know that you need to have a focus on overtime hours, or you know you need to focus on improving access to living wages. Where have other people shared their data? Can you look at your supply chain, publish it to one of the public domains such as the Open Supply Hub, and look for other partners who may want to work on the same areas as you in the same location? Find other people to increase your leverage, to increase your commitment. Say, we've got these risks identified in this supply chain. Shall we work together, increase our leverage, improve our resources here to tackle these difficult issues, and understand what type of workers are most likely to be affected in these supply chains. So when you're looking at activities to do, you know how to tailor them to the workers that are involved. Do you have a high proportion of migrant workers whose needs might be slightly different, or whose lack of access to some of the resources you may be about to create might actually impact what those activities are? Start to have these conversations out of this risk data. Our next part of our due diligence cycle, moving us along, is really around the mitigation activities and remediation activities. We've identified our risks, we've committed to work on them. How do we report on mitigation and on remedy? The key thing here is relating our KPIs back to the actions that we have taken. So they're really evidencing the story of our improvement. If we know that human rights due diligence is about continuous improvement, we really need to be committing to evidencing how and what has worked at each stage, showing that the activities that we have done relate back to those risks we identified. They are related to our salient risks, and they are evidencing change, or if they are not evidencing change, that we are addressing that we are identifying that as a problem area, and we'll be addressing and changing our activities accordingly. So it is always evidencing improvement. So we might look at some of the data on the number of NCs that have been closed over the last year. So in that risk area, for instance, here from our own reporting data out of SEDEX, I know that 72% of all NCs that were open during 2021 were closed in the CODA area of employment as regularly provided. So if you have identified earlier that you have a risk around casual work, around non-typical working, around temporary employment, that this is something that you've been trying to address, you can use the data from our services and from other sources to be able to evidence how you're working on this and how you're working with your suppliers to help to close that gap and to narrow and lessen that risk. You can also report on the other activities you have done. If you have identified that you have needed to do capacity building activities, who has been trained, where have you trained them, what have you trained them on? Those kind of data points will help people to understand exactly how you're expecting to have any impact through these activities, what your long-term goals are. Where you have remediation, you may want to report on the percentage of issues that have been resolved over the last year, the expansion of grievance mechanisms, so there is access to those mechanisms across your supply chain. And when we're looking at this data that we're doing here, well, this is not the end of the line of our data usage. We're really saying Yes, we have identified these actions. We have taken these actions. We're not stopping here. Where are they not working? It is absolutely fine within your reporting on due diligence to report on what has not worked. This is not a negative grade against you. This is showing your commitment to improvement. This is saying, we have tried this. We don't have all the answers yet. We recognize this isn't working. This is what we're going to do next because of that. We need to undertake a different activity. That is what legislative bodies want to see. They want to see that you are being proactive. They don't want to see that you are just being responsible, trying to hide or fudge the issue here because you've committed to activities. They want to know that you are actually looking for what is working and that you are going to take actions where it is not working. So that's really what we want to start to report on in this area. So the last kind of section here of our due diligence cycle that I really want to focus on is this learning and improvement area. So this gets into a little bit of those impact targets that you might have in your business. You might have these long-term goals. You might want to be improving wages. You might want to be meeting living wage within a particular commodity in your supply chain within X number of years. You need to have evidenced those actions that you've taken in the meantime and how you're addressing that issue. But this is really showing that that long-term goal is also being achieved. Do you have not just closure of those 72% of irregular employment NCs, not just that they are closed, are they remaining closed? Have the actions that you've taken actually got to the root cause of that problem and are leading to long-term impact here? Do you see an increase in wages if you are committed to working on living wage? Have the activities that you identified in your risk related to wage actually ended in activities that would help it? Did you see there an increase in maybe in worker representative committees being formed, the opportunity to have collective bargaining in supply chains, which might provide better access to living wage? Did you see through your longer term commitments to contracts with your suppliers that you see more sustained and improved wages off the back of that as there is more security in those supply chains? Have those actions ended up in these results that you wanted to see? Have you got that increase in women in supervisory roles? Again, these are all about your salient risks and how you're addressing them. But we also know that these positive impacts for people and for environment in your supply chain have real positive impacts for business as well. We see through our own impact data that where, for instance, you have improved health and safety results through our audits, you also see less turnover in site, or you see fewer absences from the business. Here I have another statistic where we have women in supervisory roles. If there is a proportionate split of women in supervisory roles, we see 38.5% fewer business critical or critical NCs on average in those comparable sites. So there are real business benefits to what are also these mitigating these human rights risks. And then how do you use this data? Again, going back to that first due diligence cycle, remembering that this is a continuous process. You can't just stop at reaching those targets. You've still got to keep learning and keep improving, and due diligence continues. Which of your activities have not had the desired long-term effect? What changes do you need to make? And then also, what have you done that has worked, and how can you report on that so others can learn from that effort? And how can you replicate it or use those learnings to help to mitigate your new salient risks that you have identified as you have built up mitigation plans for these salient risks? So starting right back again with those policy commitments, what do you need to commit to now to work on? Where are your new risks? And how can you take those learnings that you've had through all this process forward with you? Data is the key to drive this. Knowing what has worked, actually having evidence of what has worked, will really help you to improve your performance all round and also meet all of your reporting obligations. A last little message on those reporting obligations. There is a huge spread of different reporting frameworks out there that you may be reporting against, or that may be scraping your data to assess you against, that are out there to help you to understand what you should be reporting and where you should be putting your time and effort. The good thing about the due diligence cycle is that whilst it is low in having specified KPIs that you must report on, it is a very clear process. It is about your ownership of those risks and how you address them that is clear, so they can be driven from yourself. But the same process answers the same questions for all these different types of reporting frameworks. So where you've committed to identifying particular rights and following through those actions, that same data will help you to both comply with legislation, but also evidence your sustainability to different ESG frameworks as well. But if you are looking for KPIs, there's a lot of different frameworks out there. I do recommend looking at some of the benchmarking frameworks out there to really understand what people are looking for and how they're going to assess you. And that's everything from me. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's super interesting to understand how each of those areas across the due diligence process can be evidenced, and how businesses can actually use that data as well to support that. So thank you very much, Claire. Next up, heading over to Ian. Ian, off you go.
Thank you very much. So pleasure to be here. I'm going to be focusing more on metrics around decarbonization and environmental factors. Whereas Emitwise also supports companies similarly to SEDEX. So I'll be focusing on that area and showing you some of the more important metrics, some of the ones that are more generic that you probably need to start tracking if you're not tracking already, because you're going to have to report to certain frameworks, and others that are more advanced that other organizations that we know, we work with, and what we're seeing in the industry towards what's happening in this decarbonization piece. So I'll go into my next slide. So I'll first start with surface level carbon metrics and environmental metrics here. Companies need to start tracking a range of metrics, especially to report, as I mentioned, to upcoming regulations such as CSRD. These are some of the more basic metrics that companies are going to track and report to with both internal and external stakeholders. They need to track emissions, and you would have all heard of these words. You need to track your emissions for scope 1 and 2. More importantly, now you're going to have to start tracking your supply chain emissions, or your scope 3 emissions. You're going to have to start reporting these emissions towards certain frameworks like CSRD, or in the US, in the California Sustainability Act. So there's a range of frameworks that are going to start asking about this data. And you're going to have to start reporting these emissions per scope, per category, and with different breakdowns that are really important, but also for you to start taking action. So you want to understand where your hotspots lie, where are the areas that you can improve, and where you need to start taking action in your supply chain. Usually these frameworks will ask you to report for categories that are considered material to you, and this is anywhere from if they account anywhere from 2 to 5% of your aggregated emissions, they are going to be material, and you're probably going to have to report towards them. So it's important that you keep these figures in mind. In order to track emissions correctly, you are also going to have to track energy consumptions, fuel consumptions, water, waste, and a range of other environmental KPIs. These have their impact on other environmental KPIs, but also specifically on climate change, because all of them have an associated carbon or GHG impact in your supply chain. For example, I wanted to use here CSRD is going to ask you here in Europe to report your total energy consumption from non-renewable sources, divided into fuel consumption from coal, fuel consumption from natural gas, fuel consumption from petrol, etc. So you're going to have to start having these breakdowns that are going to be really important going forward. I'm going to take a little step further, and what happens when you have measured all of these metrics and when you're tracking your emissions, what happens then? Especially focus around supply chain emissions. Scope 3 metrics and targets are probably one of the biggest challenges that companies are facing. I think there's an example here with the science-based target initiatives, and some of you might have a science-based target already. There's a criteria that companies must set scope 3 reduction targets, and these targets must include either and or supplier engagement targets or reduction targets that covers, I think it is 67% of your scope 3 emissions. So a significant amount of your emissions are going to have to be covered by targets and or supplier engagement targets. Therefore, it's going to be increasingly important for you to start taking these metrics into action. There are many ways to reduce scope 3 emissions and track those KPIs. For example, going to more sustainable logistics, circularity in your products, reducing use phase emissions of products that you might be selling, etc. But one of the most important things that we are seeing and our customers are seeing is that without engaging suppliers, your companies are going to struggle to meet the targets that they have set, whether it's a science-based target or whether it's just aligning with the Paris Agreement of 2050. So we are increasingly seeing this in the market. Corporations, I think Microsoft this week released a statement saying that they were going to make some key suppliers switch to 100% carbon-free electricity in order for them to get back on track with their targets. So these types of things are going to be increasingly important going forward. What happens if companies want to start tracking towards net zero? Understanding supply chain maturities and collecting primary data from suppliers is going to become a necessity, especially if you have these targets, as I was mentioning before. Now, in the next few slides, I'll go into a bit more detail about these advanced metrics that companies are starting to track. If I'll go to the next slide just a second. I just wanted to show this as an example of what our customers are doing with Midwise, but also what we're seeing as a trend in a cross-industry approach. First of all, most companies, what they begin to do to understand, once they've got their scope 3 measurements, is they want to understand what the maturity of their suppliers is and where their risk and hotspots in their supply chain. Usually this first step is where companies can screen for publicly available data, as the emissions is something that's shared increasingly through the CDP or through science-based targets. It's important that you can collect primary data from already available resources, also reducing fatigue on certain suppliers. What we tend to see is that 20% of your suppliers will account for 80% of your emissions. So that's usually a good target to set initially, especially for the screening process. And what screening allows companies to do is understand, areas and risks in their supply chain and where they need to focus and target their engagement to ensure that they're collecting the relevant data. And carbon emissions and supply chain emissions hasn't been a heavily regulated area, especially in scope 3, but now increasingly with the likes of the new regulations, it's going to be more and more heavily reviewed. Once you've screened those suppliers and you have an understanding of the maturity, the next step is to start to engage suppliers and focus your engagement on the suppliers that have higher risks and be able to collect primary data from those suppliers. So now I'll go into a bit more detail of metrics that we're seeing here. I'll go to the next slide. Here we are. So these metrics are starting to get a bit more specific around supply chain emissions and supply chain environmental factors. It can be overwhelming to look at your supply chain, and maybe you have 1,000+ suppliers that account for 80% of your emissions. That's a lot of suppliers that you want to collect data from. So screening gives you that data that probably you're going to need to define a path for your decarbonization strategy. And usually what we tend to see here is that customers or companies want to understand how many of their suppliers report publicly, how many of the suppliers report scope 1, 2 energy publicly. Do any of those suppliers also report scope 3 emissions and therefore are more advanced than other suppliers? Out of all of my suppliers, how many have set targets? How many of those targets are validated by science-based? Are you reporting to CDP? What are the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project? What is your score on the Carbon Disclosure Project as a proxy of your performance? So there's a range of factors that you can already get from publicly available data to give you that understanding. The bad news or not so great news is that what we're seeing with most companies is that suppliers, especially on the environmental, but more specifically on the carbon perspective, are relatively immature. We tend to see that anywhere from 60 to 80% of suppliers in our customer supply chains are either partially tracking some of the emissions, so maybe some scope 1 and 2 emissions, or not tracking any emissions at all. Many of them not tracking Scope 3. So what we tend to see is a really low maturity in the supply chain. So it means it's really difficult for you if you've set 25% reduction target for your Scope 3 by 2030, and 80% of your suppliers are not measuring their emissions and have not set targets. You're going to struggle increasingly to meet those targets yourself, without having to work with your suppliers to meet those targets. At this stage, companies want to define what suppliers they want to target. So usually most companies will focus on the ones that are more immature, and you will focus on giving them the tools or trying to upskill them in order to give you the data that is required. If customers detect that most of their suppliers are immature, our recommendation is you find a solution like EmitWise that supports, it's specifically focused on supporting suppliers to advance their maturity and provide them the tools that they require to calculate their emissions and potentially therefore start setting targets and start tracking towards those reduction initiatives. Once you start engaging suppliers, you will be able to start tracking more and more specific metrics in your supply chain that are going to be increasingly important for both sustainability and procurement teams to start making decisions around Scope 3. What you'll be able to do is, for example, calculate supply-specific emission factors, validate those emission factors, whether they are accurate or not, but also track the impact against your own baseline and calculations, and more importantly, start benchmarking suppliers against industries, against industry averages, but also between suppliers themselves to understand which suppliers are performing better, which suppliers are better aligned to my own targets, and which suppliers are going to help me in the end achieve what I need to achieve, which is to decarbonize by 2050. More importantly, and touching back on what Claire was talking about, this is an ongoing process. It's important that these suppliers are brought onto the journey. You're going to want to start tracking data from suppliers on at least an annual basis, because you're going to want to make sure that your suppliers are also reducing at a similar rate to you, and that you're going to be able to meet your targets and your KPIs, and that your suppliers are coming together in that way and are going to help you meet those targets. Go to the next slide. Just to help this land a bit, I wanted to show you an example of what we've seen with this particular project that we're running, and show these metrics and bring them to life. Once you collect and calculate emissions for your suppliers, companies are able to understand which suppliers, as I mentioned before, are, let's say, higher emitters. And in this example, we have two suppliers from the same industry providing the same services to a customer. And as you can see, one of them is 7 times more emitting than the other supplier. So it's important to understand that you've got here a supplier that potentially is a hotspot in your supply chain. What this data allows companies to do is understand which suppliers are performing best, but also start taking credit for the suppliers that are performing well, and more importantly, start taking action with the suppliers that are potentially not performing as well. For example, what our customers are using this data to is to, by understanding which suppliers need more support and intentionally which hotspots those suppliers might have in their supply chain, introducing initiatives to those suppliers so that they can start reducing and setting targets towards the same targets that you are setting. So what we're seeing is that companies are saying, okay, this initiative is working great with these suppliers. Why don't I move this initiative to these suppliers that are not performing as well, to try to support them in that journey and bring them along the net zero journey. This is important now because we still have time till 2030, 2040, 2050 to take action. However, as soon as we start getting closer to the dates that you have set your targets, what we're seeing is that procurement people will start making decisions based on what suppliers are performing best and which suppliers are going to allow me to take those targets when they're doing procurement decisions. This might be much farther away for most of you, but it is something that will begin to happen. I'll go into the next slide just a second. There we go. So as I was saying before, and I touched upon it a lot, this is going to be increasingly important for procurement teams to understand what suppliers are doing. One of the things that we are trying to support our customers and suppliers is with, similarly to SEDEX, is that we tell suppliers the areas where they can improve. We give them scores a scorecard based on the data that we receive to give them the guidance that they need to continuously improve and continuously become better. And this is increasingly important, and especially with the shift from scope 3, from sustainability and the merge into also sustainable procurement teams, all these types of metrics are going to be really important for you to make sure you're tracking towards your targets. I'm going to go to one important slide next, and here I want just to show you an example. One of the really important things that we recommend our customers is that they also start collecting initiatives from suppliers to understand what suppliers are doing to reduce their emissions. It's important because on one side you can track and you can start forecasting what the impact of those initiatives are going to have in your own supply chain emissions, but it also starts giving you data on what sort of initiatives other suppliers, as I mentioned before, in your supply chain are going to be able to do, or you're going to be able to recommend or invest in, as Microsoft is doing with some of their key suppliers. And this is going to be the data that you're going to potentially need if you want to decarbonize your supply chain. So it's really important that you find a solution that allows you also to achieve this kind of impact. As I said before, and I mentioned CSRD a few times, there's an increasing landscape of regulations and growing regulatory expectations, especially with CSRD here in Europe, CBAM, FLAG, and others in the US, for example. And a lot of those have a particular focus on supply chain, a particular focus on supply chain environmental KPIs, and a more important focus and increasing focus on the scope 3 piece, especially under CSRD or CBAM, for example. So it's going to be really important for companies to start tracking all of these metrics to ensure that they align and meet all the regulatory expectations that are coming forward, and whether these these regulations don't impact yourself directly, they're going to probably impact your customers and therefore you indirectly, or they're probably going to impact your suppliers and therefore you indirectly as well. So it's important that we start keeping these in mind as we take the next steps towards net zero. And I think I hand over back to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's really interesting actually to see how social and environment are starting to come together, and actually the similarities in terms of the way that you've got to identify the processes, start collecting the data, putting in those mitigation and remediation strategies, and then sort of enhancing the learning across your own business, but also suppliers as well. So thank you very much there, Ian. We do have some extra resources on our website as well, which you can see on the attachments section or visiting the sedex.com website. Just before we go into the questions, just as a sort of quick overview, while Sedex is renowned for our platform of collecting social data and also our SMETA audit, we also offer services around consulting, supporting businesses to be able to put in policies and help with their sustainability practices, as well as our training policies, which not only help capacity building for your business, but also for your suppliers. And we've got a massive community as well that always joins up regularly as well. So without that, we'll head into the questions. So we've got some questions here. If there's any others that you'd like to add, please leave a question in the comment box. There's a question here which I can answer straight away. Will this session be recorded and sent out afterwards? Yes, the session is recorded and will be sent out afterwards with the slides as well. Right, so Claire, question for you. How can companies ensure the accuracy and reliability of sustainability data collected from their suppliers, particularly in complex global supply chains?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you very much. I can speak to this. I don't know, Ian, you might also have something you want to leap in on. From our side, as Sedex, this is something that we are constantly working on. We have an audit quality program that is there to improve the quality of our audits and the consistency of that data collection to really improve its reliability. My role is to improve the methodology of SMETA. So it is collecting and identifying the right risks so that the data that you're receiving is improved and more reliable over time. But beyond the activities that we do within Sedex, within your own supply chain, data transparency is kind of a two-way street here, where you have an open relationship with your suppliers, where they are being built into your due diligence processes as a trusted partner. They will provide you with accurate data. If they see that you're looking for this improvement and want to facilitate improvement and commit to improvement with them as partners, you're much more likely to get back accurate data, honest data, than if you're taking a very heavy-handed or downward approach or a short-term approach to your relationship with your suppliers. Don't know, Ian, if you've anything you want to add.
Yeah, I would add from an emissions perspective and the carbon emissions perspective in a supply chain, it's complicated. There's no specific regulations in terms of what the data provided by suppliers needs to look like and how to track that accuracy of that. What I've seen, well, what at least Emitwise does, and I've seen a lot of solutions out there do as well, is that based on certain frameworks like the GHG protocol, we have built in data validation checks to understand whether the data received from suppliers is inside certain expected ranges, for industries, to also understand from a more take the subjection out of the picture, from a more automated perspective, whether the data that we're receiving from suppliers is valid and useful. There will be cases where this is, especially around emissions, it's a collaboration, and what we see is that companies need to work with suppliers to ensure that the data improves over time, and these types of scorecards or risks also allow suppliers to increasingly improve as they go forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. We got another question here around how will I know which ESG reporting framework is relevant for my business, or what regulation applies to my business? Thank you. I'll put that towards you, Claire, since you covered off the regulation slide.
So the information is out there for each of these reporting frameworks and each of these legislations. There is information on all of them out there, but it can be very overwhelming. There is an awful lot to have to digest. Within SEDEX, we have a consulting department. This is a key service that they provide within the consulting department, which is to help do that mapping for you to find out exactly which legislation apply to you, which frameworks you may want to use or to submit on, where there are benefits to you, to really help you to do that mapping. But otherwise, this is all out there. It is just a bit of legwork.
Awesome. There's a question here: does SEDEX plan on expanding its supply chain engagement to include more environmental sustainability questions? Great question. I can actually answer this one. Yes, the answer is yes. Later this year, we're actually going to be launching our environment self-assessment questionnaire. So this is actually going to allow our members to be able to collect information on their own sites, but also the supplier sites as well, to monitor their environmental performance, track their policies, and also, alluding to what Ian said there, is also being able to see their maturity level as well. So stay tuned for that lucky and good product coming soon as well. We've got another question here. Ian, this one's going to be aimed towards you. What are the best practices for setting ambitious yet achievable targets for reducing Scope 3 emissions?
I think it's a great question. The first, our recommendation, what we've seen happen a lot, is that companies have set targets, especially for Scope 3, without having a good understanding of their Scope 3 emissions and having a good and accurate baseline. And what happens in those cases is that then you need to re-baseline and reset targets. If those targets have been with science-based, then you need to pay again. So it's a significant impact for organizations. So our recommendation, before our customers set a science-based target or any type of net zero target, especially for Scope 3, is to do a really accurate assessment of your Scope 3 emissions, what categories of Scope 3 are relevant and have an impact in your baseline, and which ones you should be reporting to. And once you have a good understanding of all your categories and your emissions, also try to get the granularity that you need to understand the hotspots. So emissions for your different suppliers, what are your largest emitters, what are your categories that are most emitting. Once you have that data, you are in a good position to set a target, because you know where you can take action, where you can take focus, and whether it's achievable or not. Then you have a lot of guidance, for example, from science-based targets on what's an achievable target, and also industry-specific guidance that you can lean on. But it's really important to set the target on a baseline that's accurate and that's going to help you not have to do it again and again.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian. There's a question here as well. What tools is recommended to use to get suppliers to submit their emissions?
I feel there's a lot of tools out there. On one side, you have tools like CDP. CDP offers the opportunity to collect supply chain emissions. There are other tools similar to CDP that you can use to collect emissions from suppliers. Usually, one of the main things that we see is that these types of solutions allow you to collect available data. However, as I was explaining, I was touching upon before, what we tend to see is that, especially around emissions, there's not that much available data from suppliers. So only having a platform that allows suppliers to input data is not going to be as valuable, because you're going to have coverage for 10, 20% maybe. So our recommendation is usually to find a solution like Emitwise or another solution that, in addition to collecting available data, offers tools for suppliers to produce and generate that data for you. Because if not, you're going to reach a situation where you're only going to have a really low or partial coverage of your supply chain.
Excellent. Thanks, Ian. I'll give you a moment to rest. Claire, there's a question here saying, how do I reduce audit fatigue?
It's a really good question. It's one that we get an awful lot. Within SEDEX, we accept onto our platform multiple different audit bodies. You can upload those audits onto our platform so that they, or audit methodologies, so that they get shared with all of your linked buyers or linked members on our platform. We also have the linking feature in order to reduce that fatigue, so that you're not getting requests from every single one of your buyers. You should be being able to share one audit with multiple members really does help to reduce that audit necessity, that audit fatigue. So we do constantly try to work with other partners to really, again, accept them on our site, and also look for mutual recognition where we can, where SEDEX is accepted as part of other certification schemes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire. Ian, regarding SBTI engagement targets, what level of ambition is required for these types of targets? For example, what percentage of suppliers would need to have an SBT themselves? I've seen a range from 20 to 75% suppliers to have an SBT within the 5-year time frame, but not seen any clear guidelines from SBTI on this. Any insights? Thank you.
So yeah, so I tried to touch upon this in one of the slides. I think one of the guidances from SBTI is that you need to set a target for your scope 3, and that target needs to include plans to address reductions, or at least I think it's 67% of your scope 3 emissions. What this means is that you can cover those reductions by saying, okay, I'm going to engage 70% of my emission, well, the suppliers that account for 70% of my emissions, and reduce those towards net zero. Or you can mix that and say, okay, I'm going to engage with 30%, but the other 45% I'm going to reduce through other means. So the total has to make up that net zero target. It doesn't all have to be supply engagement. It can be a mixture of reductions and supply engagement. So probably that's why you've seen a difference between people setting 20% to others setting 70%.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ian. There was another question as well. I have heard that SBTI will no longer allow Scope 3 Category 1 engagement targets starting in 2025. Is that the case? If so, does that change money for something like Emitwise?
I would need to specifically review that because I don't have the exact question on it, exact answer for it. So probably worth us writing that down and getting back in touch, because I'm not specifically sure. I think there is something, but it's not specific around Scope 3 Category 1. It's specific about a categorization that SBTI uses. So I would need to look at the response.
Thank you very much. So final question coming in. Are you seeing examples of clauses for suppliers holding them to account on specific emission reductions?
We are increasingly seeing emission reductions becoming a part of RFQs and RFP processes for suppliers. More advanced organizations are bringing this into supply codes of conduct, so they are setting reduction targets for key suppliers. However, I would say this is something that's happening with advanced organizations and potential organizations that have a large purchasing power. What we're trending to see is still a carrot instead of a stick. So we are seeing people recommending reductions, but not obliging them right now.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers as well for that informative session. Just a reminder, you can go into the attachment sections of this webinar. You can give us feedback. You can learn more about SEDEX and EMIT-wise, as well as talk to the team as well, and also download the slide presentations that we've gone through. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Goodbye all.
Bye.
Bye.